From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I have the special pleasure of introducing the enormously accomplished Jeanne Theoharis, author of The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. That's not often two things you hear in the same sentence, that rebellious life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. Mrs. Rosa Parks is a subject I take great personal interest in and draw inspiration from. The biography was a 2014 NAACP Image Award winner for outstanding literary work. It received a 2013 Letitia Woods Brown Award from the Association of Black Women Historians and was one of the Choice Top 25 academic titles for 2015. Reviewers call it the definitive political biography of Rosa Parks. It examines her 6 decades of activism and corrects the notion of Rosa Parks as a single-act, accidental hero of the civil rights movement, and instead shows her to be a woman of radical politics, radicalized in part by the lynching of Emmett Till, who fought to bring attention to and action against the American racial caste system in jobs, schools, public services, and criminal justice. Jeanne Theoharis is a distinguished professor of political science at Brooklyn College and the author of numerous books and articles on the civil rights and Black power movements, the politics of race in education, social welfare, and civil rights in post-9/11 America. Her books include School Sucks, When Students Talk Back to a Segregated Nation, and Want to Start a Revolution? Women in the Black Revolt. I mention these titles specifically because I really just wanted to say those names. She has written about rethinking the Watts uprising and the character of Black protest in Los Angeles and has contended the arc of justice runs through Ferguson. With the late Julian Bond, she wrote, "Why don't scholars have access to Rosa Parks' archives?" for the Washington Post. And here's what she said. "It is unthinkable that a collection of Thomas Jefferson's or Martin Luther King Jr.'s papers could be locked away for 4 years, let alone put up for auction without a single scholar being allowed a preliminary view to assess its value to American culture and history. But Rosa Parks has been reduced to a children's book hero, lauded as the mother of the civil rights movement, but not treated as a serious political thinker in her own right. Ms. Theoharis has an undergraduate degree in Afro-American Studies from Harvard University and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Michigan. Her many awards include being a recipient of the Rockefeller Humanities Fellowship, as well as a fellowship for the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please join me in welcoming Jeanne Theoharis.
Good afternoon, or good morning, or good noon. Before we get started, I wanted to talk for a second about a very exciting development. You heard about an op-ed that Julian Bond, who passed away 3 weeks ago, and I wrote a couple years ago about Rosa Parks' papers being trapped in an auction house in New York following an estate dispute. They'd been priced at this exorbitant figure. And this summer, at the beginning of the fall, Howard Buffett, son of Warren Buffett, made an extraordinary donation and bought all of her material effects, and as you may know, then donated the papers and the photographs to the Library of Congress on a 10-year loan, and those opened in February. And they are remarkable. And any of us can go to the Library of Congress and see them, and I would recommend that if you even have a couple hours, the manuscript reading room of the Library of Congress is open 6 days a week, so it's open on Saturdays, and it's open 8:30 to 5, so they are tremendous. If you only get to go for an hour, I recommend going directly to Box 18, folders 9 to 11, because there you will hear Rosa Parks' political voice. Let me read you just one taste of her political voice. "I had been pushed around all of my life and at that moment couldn't take it anymore. When I asked the policeman why we had to be pushed around, because I think a lot of times people think about her as quiet. When I asked the policeman why we had to be pushed around, he said he didn't know the law is the law. Let us look, this is back to her voice, let us look at Jim Crow for the criminal he is and what he has done to one life multiplied millions of times over the United States. So you can go and read her and hear her in much greater detail than I'm going to be able to do today. So I wanted to start with that because it is a remarkable, remarkable set of papers and photographs. And we are in the great debt, I think, of Howard Buffett for ensuring that the public now gets a view of those. So on February 27th, 2013, Rosa Parks desegregated the US Capitol. A statue of Rosa Parks was installed in Statuary Hall, the first statue of a black person to be put there. And in a rare moment of bipartisan unity, congressional leaders from both sides of the aisle joined President Obama to dedicate the statue. House Speaker John Boehner called the statue dedication a great way to celebrate America. Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi talked about Rosa Parks as she did what was natural. She was tired, so she sat down. And President Obama talks about her singular act of courage. I wrote my book to counter those frames of Rosa Parks. There was nothing natural or tired about what she did, but embedded in a lifetime of political activism. It was not an easy, simple celebration of America, as she had spent her entire life sort of saying America had far to go in terms of justice and equality for all Americans. On that very same day across town at the Supreme Court, the court was hearing the case of Shelby County v. Holder, what many of us know as the voting rights case. And in June of that year, the Supreme Court would come back with a decision in Shelby County saying that part of the Voting Rights Act, the Section 4B, was unconstitutional, weakening dramatically the enforcement provisions of the Voting Rights Act. So here on that day, right, on the one hand we have her statue dedication, and on the other hand we have the Supreme Court taking steps to undo voter protection, something that Rosa Parks had spent decades working on. And that was not merely ironic, but I think one of the ways that the history, the fable of the civil rights movement, in many ways is being used to cover up present-day injustice when many of these people, including Rosa Parks, again, would have said no to that. So let me I'm going to spend about 15 or 20 minutes giving you a brief kind of panorama of her political life, and then we can have questions and conversation. Rosa Parks, in many ways, begins her political life in her family. Her grandfather was a supporter of Marcus Garvey, Pan-Africanist, black nationalist Marcus Garvey, and she talks about one of her very first political memories. At the age of 6, after World War I, there's this uptake of Klan violence in Alabama. There's an uptake of white violence against black people after World War I across the country. And her grandfather will sit outside, sit on the porch with his shotgun, and she would sit with him to keep vigil over their house. Because as she put it, she wanted to see him shoot a Ku Kluxer. Right? This is a very different place to begin, I think, our story of Rosa Parks. In many ways, her adult political life starts when she meets what she calls the first real activist I ever met, and that is Raymond Parks. And they fall in love. And Rosa and Raymond Parks get married in 1932, and Raymond Parks is working on the Scottsboro case. The Scottsboro case, 9 young men in Alabama. They'd been riding the rails or riding the train for free. They get arrested, and then 2 young white women are discovered in a train car also riding the rails for free, but those charges against those 9 young men get changed to rape, and those 9 young men are quickly tried, and all but the youngest one, who was 12, sentenced to death. And a local movement grows in Alabama to try to protect and defend the Scottsboro boys and to kind of ensure that they are not executed. And one of the kind of local activists in that movement is Raymond Parks, and she joins him in that activism. It is dangerous work. She talks about late night meetings, guns all over the table. Even to have a meeting was a dangerous thing. And in those early days, Raymond is really the more public activist, and she is more behind the scenes. And that's going to change and really flip And she will become the more public activist, and he will become more behind the scenes. But certainly at the heart of their love and partnership is that shared political commitment. Now, by 1943, she wants to become more active. It galls her. Her younger brother, Sylvester, is serving overseas during World War II, and it galls her that black people are being asked to serve and cannot vote at home. And so she decides to go down to a local NAACP meeting. She sees in the paper, a local black newspaper, a picture of the NAACP, and a friend of hers is in that picture, and she says she realizes that women can be part of the branch. So she goes down, and on that very first day, this is in 1943, it's branch election time. She's the only woman there, and she is elected secretary that very first day. And this will begin a decade of work for the NAACP. She makes it known she wants to register to vote. And one of Montgomery's most militant activists, a man by the name of E.D. Nixon, he's kind of a stalwart union activist, he comes to her house to bring her some materials on registering to vote, and there will begin a partnership that's going to change the face of American history. Because what Nixon and Parks are going to do is both transform Montgomery's NAACP into an activist chapter and to sort of work on issues that we would call criminal justice issues. That's one of the key things they're working on. Sort of similar to the Scottsboro case, they're working on cases, legal lynching cases, cases where black men are wrongfully accused. And they are also trying to make the law receptive to black people, and particularly black people who have been victims of white brutality or white sexual violence. And so they're working on case after case, and they have very little success. And she is growing more and more discouraged. She keeps going. She spends a lot of the late 40s traveling Alabama, taking testimony. They try to file testimonies to the Department of Justice. And again, this is dangerous work, and she is growing more and more discouraged. By the 1950s, she's working at the biggest downtown department store, that's Montgomery Fair, as an assistant tailor in the men's shop. Montgomery Fair is a segregated department store, so what that means is that black people can shop there, but they can't try on clothes. And what it means for black people who work there is the employee cafeteria is segregated, the elevators are segregated, and so she's working in the tailor shop, basically tailoring white men's suits. It's the men's shop. And at night, she's also sewing on the side, and she's sewing for one of the few kind of liberal white families in Montgomery, and that's Clifford and Virginia Durr. And Virginia Durr is a longtime activist, and she's affiliated with an adult organizer training school called Highlander Folk School. And Mrs. Durr realizes how kind of discouraged Mrs. Parks has become and recommends her for a scholarship to Highlander Folk School. Highlander Folk School begins in the 1930s, and with the premise that local people are the best to solve their own problems, to lead their own problems, but that leadership needs to be cultivated and that people need to come together to sort of develop those skills. And that summer, Rosa Parks will take 2 weeks off from work to go to Tennessee to Highlander. And again, she gets to Highlander very, as she would put it, bitter and discouraged. And Highlander is very transformative for a number of reasons. Highlander is an interracial organizer training school. Black and white people eat together, they share, it's sort of a dorm situation, they share rooms together, they meet together, they talk together. And this lifts her spirits. And it lifts her spirits because she is in a 2-week workshop on school desegregation with 50 other adults, strategizing on how to implement school desegregation, and that lifts her spirits. Still in all, at the end of the 2 weeks, like any good organizer meeting, right, they do the, what are you going to do when you go back home? And they get to Rosa Parks, and Rosa Parks says, there will never be a mass movement in Montgomery. White resistance, this is the cradle of the Confederacy. White resistance is too great, and black people aren't unified. So I am holding out my hope for young people. And I stress that because Rosa Parks, throughout her life, drew solace and drew energy from the militancy of young people. And I think over this past year, as we have seen Black Lives Matter kind of ripple through the country, there has been this misimpression that this is nothing like the civil rights movement, when people like Rosa Parks always saw the energy of young people, the militancy of young people, as the hope for the future. So she says, I'm holding out my hope for young people, and I'm going to go back to Montgomery and work with young people. This is August of 1955. 4 days before her bus stand, she attends a big mass meeting at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, that's Martin Luther King's church, because the organizer around the Emmett Till case has come to Montgomery. Now, Emmett Till is the 14-year-old Chicago boy who had been lynched in Mississippi. And the organizer has come to Montgomery because the two men who lynched Emmett Till had just been acquitted. And he has come to try to draw attention to that and to keep the attention and movement going. And Rosa Parks is in the audience that night, E.D. Nixon is in the audience that night, Martin Luther King is in the audience that night, and they are angry and they are despairing, right? Because unlike many of the cases they'd worked on in Montgomery, in the Emmett Till case, they'd gotten an indictment, and still and all, those two men had just been acquitted. So here we are at December 1st, 1955, and she boards the bus somewhere around 6 o'clock that night. This is after work. She actually lets a bus go by. It's too crowded, goes to the drugstore, gets on the bus, sits in the middle section. The middle section is, in some ways, a no man's land in that Black people are allowed to sit there, but as she would put it, on the whim of the driver, could be asked to move. She is not sitting in the white section, and she over and over makes this clear. Now, after a couple of stops, the bus fills up, and there is one white man left standing. And by the terms of Alabama segregation, all 4 people in the row that she is sitting in will have to get up so that one person can sit down. And the bus driver tells them to get up, and at first no one moves. And the bus driver says, again, you all better make it light on yourself. And she says, reluctantly, the other 3 people get up, and she, pushed as far as she could be pushed, refuses. Now, every middle schooler learns that Rosa Parks is courageous, that what she does that day is courageous. But I think we miss what is actually courageous about what she's about to do. And I think there are 2 things we miss. The first is she knows full well what can happen, because she is not the first person to refuse to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery. Right? There has been a trickle of people, particularly in the decade before her bus stand, that have done this. A woman by the name of Viola White in 1944 refuses to give up her seat, is arrested, chooses to pursue her legal case, and the police rape her daughter. In 1950, a Black veteran by the name of Hilliard Brooks resists on the bus, and police kill him. He lives across, she's living in the Cleveland Courts Projects. He lives kind of across the alleyway from her. And earlier that year, a 15-year-old by the name of Claudette Colvin refuses to give up her seat on the bus, and Colvin is manhandled by police as she is taken from the bus. So Rosa Parks knows full well what can happen to her, and that is courageous. But I would argue that the single thing that makes it the most courageous is she had made stands before. People she knew had made stands before. There is nothing to suggest that this stand is going to be different, and yet and still she does it again. And so I would argue that the courage is the courage of perseverance. It is the courage of acting even though you cannot know what's going to happen. Because I think sometimes the way we teach these moments, we teach Rosa Parks, we teach Martin Luther King, is somehow there's a sign that they know what's going to happen, when in fact there is no sign, and there's a lot to suggest that nothing will happen. And in one of my favorite quotes from Rosa Parks, she talks about being very annoyed and irritated by her arrest. And I think in that language we can see that she doesn't expect this to become the beginning of a great movement. But it is a line for her that has been crossed, and therefore she is willing to take this risk. She is arrested, she is taken to jail and bailed out about 4 hours later. and by both Edie Nixon and her husband, and they come back because once Edie Nixon realizes that Rosa Parks is okay, he is in a measure delighted because they have been looking for a test case, and here in Rosa Parks is the test case they've been looking for. In part because she's the right kind of plaintiff. She's 42 at this point. She's married. She's active in her church, right? So she's the right image. But he also knows that she's brave. And they need to be able to trust that someone who they're going to put forth in a case like this is not going to flinch under the pressure that's about to come, right, to anyone who makes these kind of stands. And at first, Raymond is not supportive of pursuing the case. Raymond is worried both that she will be killed, but also that people won't stand behind them, right? That the community will be intimidated over time. But late that night, they decide to go forward, and she calls a young black lawyer in town by the name of Fred Gray to ask him to represent her. And even later that night, he calls the head of the Women's Political Council, which is a black women's political group in Montgomery, Joanne Robinson, to tell her. And it is the Women's Political Council that decides that on the Monday that Rosa Parks will be arraigned in court, they will call for a one-day boycott. And so Joanne Robinson, who is a professor at Alabama State College, sneaks into the college in the middle of the night, and she runs off 35,000 leaflets, much to the chagrin of the president of Alabama State, who almost fires her for this. And early the next morning, so this all happens on Thursday, early Friday morning, Joanne Robinson and the women of the Women's Political Council fan out over Montgomery to distribute these leaflets all around town. Now, meanwhile, Edie Nixon, again, a seasoned organizer himself, is about to go on a Pullman run, but he knows they're going to need the ministers, some of the ministers, to preach about this on Sunday for this to be successful. So at about 5 in the morning, he starts calling ministers, and he calls Ralph Abernathy, and then he calls a very young new minister in town by the name of Martin Luther King. Wakes him up at 6 in the morning. Again, King is 26. He's been in Montgomery about a year. They have a brand new baby, a 1-month-old baby. And he wakes King up. And King had been active in the NAACP for the year he was there. And Nixon wants to use King's church for a meeting of the ministers because it's centrally located downtown Montgomery. And King says, like many of us would say if somebody called you at 6 in the morning and had a scheme for something that they wanted you to do, what does he say? Can you call me back? I need to think about it. And again, I pause there, and I say that because we often think that Martin Luther King is Martin Luther King in neon, right? He knows his role, when, like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King will step into this role. He will make himself ready for that role, right? It will require decision after decision. And Nixon will call him back a couple hours later, and King will say yes, and Nixon will say, good, because I've been telling people to meet there anyways. And we know in the coming days, right, he will step in the coming months, that over that year, he will assume a kind of galvanizing leadership of the Montgomery bus boycott. But again, that is about choices and about having to make decision after decision. Now, that Monday morning, Rosa Parks wakes up very nervous, right? Most of the seasoned activists in Montgomery were very nervous. Would people actually stay off the buses? And she talks about that morning as being the most important moment of the boycott for her because of the ways that people had stayed off the buses. And yet she says, I don't know why it took us so long. That night, there is a massive mass meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church where the community decides to turn this one-day boycott into an indefinite boycott. And that boycott will last 382 days. Now, most of the boycott, Rosa Parks will be fired from her job at Montgomery Fair about 5 weeks later. Raymond will also lose his job, and so the Parks family will spend the boycott without steady work. Rosa Parks will also spend that year traveling the country, raising money for the boycott, and turning this local struggle into a national movement. All the while, again, her own family situation is very, very precarious. On December 20th, 1956, by the order of the Supreme Court, Montgomery's buses are desegregated. We obviously have that very famous picture on the bus that day of Rosa Parks. But even though we have the successful end of the boycott, the Parks family's own situation does not improve. They still have trouble finding work. She's still getting death threats. And so 8 months after the boycott ends, the Parks family will be forced to leave Montgomery, and they will move to Detroit, where her brother Sylvester is now living. Now, I think most of us, if you even knew that she moved to Detroit, it's often talked about as the last sentence of her biography, and then she moves to Detroit, and then kind of the tagline is, and then she lives happily ever after, and she works for John Conyers. And this really misses what she will describe Detroit as the promised land that wasn't. That she didn't find too much difference in the systems of school segregation, housing segregation, policing, that she leaves in Montgomery, she finds again in Detroit. Right? The public signs of segregation are thankfully gone, but the systems of segregation are in place. And so she will spend the second half of her political life fighting the systems of racial inequality and injustice in the Jim Crow North. And she will do this in and alongside a growing Black Power movement in both Detroit and the nation. Rosa Parks describes her personal hero to be Malcolm X. And I think part of that is he reminds her of her grandfather, but I think part of that is Malcolm X very much put a spotlight on the systems of Northern racial inequality, and she was very kind of moved and grateful for that. She will be active. Rosa Parks was an internationalist, so she will be active in sort of the growing movement against the Vietnam War, in part why she supports Conyers. Rosa Parks will volunteer for Conyers' first congressional campaign in 1964. She persuades Martin Luther King to come to Detroit on Conyers' behalf. Conyers credits this as part of the reason he wins this primary. He wins the primary by about 42 votes. Again, it's hard to imagine a Congress without John Conyers, but there was a moment in 1964 when it maybe wasn't going to happen. And so one of the first things John Conyers does when he is elected is he hires Rosa Parks to work in doing constituent work in his Detroit office. And this ends a decade of economic insecurity for the Parks family. So for a decade between 1955 and 1965, the Parks family is in serious economic trouble. And if you, again, go to the Library of Congress to look at her papers, you can see a lot of the evidence of that in her papers, in her income tax statements. So John Conyers stabilizes the Parks family, and also she gets health insurance, which is a huge thing for the Parks family. So she will spend the next 20 plus years working for John Conyers and again, being part of a growing Black Power movement across the country. She will continue pressing around criminal justice issues, around poverty issues. One of my favorite pictures in the book is a picture of her protesting outside the South African embassy, calling for U.S. divestment in South Africa. To the end of her life, she will be an active opponent of the death penalty. And 8 days after 9/11, she will join with other civil rights activists like Harry Belafonte and Danny Glover, calling for no war, calling on the United States to work with the work internationally to find justice after 9/11. And so that was an incredibly prescient statement that they issue, given what we have seen happen since then. So to the end of her life, Rosa Parks said the movement is not over. To the end of her life, she felt like the United States had a long way to go. And yet I think we often honor her by trapping her in the past, by feeling good about celebrating these movements and making it seem like we're done, when the actual Rosa Parks, I think, would ask us to keep going, would say there is much, much more work to be done, would be joining with Black Lives Matter, with Dream Defenders, with many of the people working on social justice and criminal justice today. And so what I think honoring her legacy requires is not only a statue, but that recommitment to the sort of things she had fought her entire life for. Thank you. I think we have time for questions. There are mics.
Hi, just a question. The famous photograph of her in the bus.
Okay.
I always thought that that was done that day, but it wasn't.
It was. It's staged, though. So that famous where she's like in profile on the bus and there's a white man sitting in front of her, it's staged by Look magazine. The white man in front of her is actually a reporter, but it is taken that day. Now, the other famous photographs of her, right? There are very famous photographs of her being fingerprinted, right? And her mugshot that often get misattributed as being from her first arrest, and they are not. 3 months into the boycott, the city is trying to break the boycott, and they arrest 89 boycott leaders on a kind of, they dredge up this old ordinance to try to, and those pictures are from that arrest, and yet they often get misattributed.
Let me follow up on that. The reason I asked that is because reading a lot of the Martin Luther King books, all these John Lewis books, there was a big emphasis at that time on the press, getting the press, getting the incidents happening before evening news and whatever. And I'm wondering if she was acclimated to that and how, because I thought that photograph was using the press to bring out points.
Yes, I mean, so most of the press that day on December 20th actually was not focused on her, right? It was really focused on King and Abernathy. There's dozens and dozens of pictures that are taken that day, and they get on and off the bus a million times. And it's Look magazine who actually takes that picture that now seems really iconic, but it was not quite so at the time. But certainly I think she understood how important the press was. She certainly understood you know, she will do so many interviews over her life. She will, you know, and I think part of why she does that is understanding the role of the media in kind of continuing to keep the struggle going.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So I'm part of the young people who were raised that Rosa Parks was courageous, but she was tired and didn't give up her seat. And we know that many school boards across the country now are working to dilute American history. And so really my question to you is, how do we make sure the next generation is taught true history in a way that makes them these social justice advocates that Rosa Parks wanted, in your opinion?
Right. Well, part of why I wrote this book, right, is that Rosa Parks at least is in the curriculum, right? I mean, we do see a kind of movement to sort of, in fact, take out even some of the stuff that's made it in. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do with the book is that she's at least there, and so we need to do something different with her. And what I'm trying to do with this work is to say, right, it's not a one-day wonder, it's not, right, it's not accidental, she's not meek, it's not over. And so one of the things that I hope people can do with this work is to take it back into the classroom, given that there is space to talk about her in classrooms, and to do something different with it, right? So it really changes, I think, how we talk about her if we sort of see criminal justice as a real issue across her life. I think it really changes how we talk about her when we see she was working class, right? She's living in the projects. I think it really changes how we talk about her when we see that half of her life she lives in Detroit, right? So that she becomes, she has this very funny thing where she says, people would often ask her if she knew Harriet Tubman. Yeah, and I think part of that is not just the ways that we struggle with chronology here in the United States, but because the way she gets presented is seen as such distant history that maybe she did know Harriet Tubman. And so I think one of the keys in terms of teaching her and bringing her into the classroom is trying to resist that, putting it in the distant past where it's over and done with, and sort of seeing how relevant it is for today. Great. But thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think you partially answered my question, but did you have any misconceptions about Rosa Parks before you did your research that enlightened you like you are enlightening us today to this new version of her?
Absolutely. I mean, so let me just begin with the first misconception. I got interested in Rosa Parks when she died. I don't know if you remember, but Rosa Parks was the first woman, the first civilian, the second African American to lay in the US Capitol, right? It's a massive honor. But you may remember, and there's a kind of congressional, it's like almost, you know, stampede to honor Rosa Parks. And yet, it just focused on the bus, right? The New York Times calls her the accidental matriarch. In the obituary for Rosa Parks, the accidental matriarch of the civil rights movement. So on the one hand, we have this incredible national honor, and on the other hand, what's being honored is just smaller and smaller. And it seemed to me, I didn't think we could divorce why we were having this national honoring of Rosa Parks from what had happened 2 months earlier, and that was Hurricane Katrina. And so one of the things that I was thinking about when I began this project was much more about the politics of memory, right? And the ways that this kind of stripped down civil rights movement and this kind of Rosa Parks was being held up in many ways to paper over the very deep and uncomfortable questions that had come out of Hurricane Katrina in terms of persistent injustice and inequality in this country. Okay, so I do this talk on the politics of memory, and a colleague says, Jeanne, will you turn this into an essay for a book I'm writing? I'm like, okay, sure, great. And then I think to myself, well, I need to actually talk about who Rosa Parks was. There has to be a good biography, I think to myself. I just can't really remember it. And I look, and there was no serious, scholarly, footnoted biography of Rosa Parks. And that seemed to correspond to what I was sort of talking about, which is that on the one hand, she's honored, and on the other hand, she's kind of turned into a children's book hero. Because there were dozens and dozens of children's and young adult books. So that's the first thing that just astonished me, was on the one hand, she's arguably one of the most famous Americans of the 20th century, and on the other hand, while we have more than 100 biographies of Lincoln, dozens of biographies of Martin Luther King, serious biographies of many, many other people in the civil rights movement, not a serious footnoted biography of Rosa Parks. So that was the first thing that surprised me. I think the second thing, I came to this project as a scholar of the civil rights movement in the North. And yet I was astonished by both that Rosa Parks lives more than half of her life in Detroit and how robust and wide her activism was. Because even though I think people had begun to talk about Rosa Parks' activism before the bus, there was really just a kind of, then it ends with the Montgomery bus boycott. And it misses that second half of her activism, that second half of her life, which I think makes her much more contemporary and relevant. And so I think it's not an accident that we don't hear about that second half. And so I think one of the, it was like revelation after revelation in terms of kind of the scope of what she was doing. As I started to do interview after interview, it was just like she was everywhere. And so I think that really, was really one of the surprising things for me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
A couple questions. First, could you talk a little bit more about the importance of E.D. Nixon?
Absolutely.
And the sleeping car porters?
Yes.
If there were, including if there were any other members of sleeping car porters in Montgomery who played an important role. That first. Second, I'm wondering if there was any point when, if you found any point when there was a risk for Rosa Parks of worse consequences than losing her job. Was she ever in any serious danger of physical violence, she or her husband or anyone around her?
Right. Let me start with that second question. They get sort of death threats. I should say this is not the first time they get death threats. Some of Rosa Parks' activism pre the boycott. For instance, when the Freedom Train comes to Montgomery, she takes a group of young people to visit it. The Freedom Train was this train that went around with all of the kind of founding documents of the United States, but one of the requirements of the Freedom Train, it was like a post-World War II thing. But one of the requirements was that it had to be desegregated, that people got to view it in a desegregated space. And in Montgomery, that was very controversial. And so Rosa Parks insists on taking a number of young people, and this is when the death threats actually begin to the Parks house. But they get so much worse during the boycott. One of the things that I actually suspect, so a number of the leaders of the boycott houses get bombed, right? E.D. Nixon, Martin Luther King, Reverend Gratz, one of the few white ministers supporting the boycott. But all of them are living in standalone houses. And I do think one of the things that may have worked to the advantage of the Parks family is they were living at Cleveland Courts projects. There were people all around. There were people, you know, there was much, it would have been much harder to get to the Parks house, to the Parks apartment, given how many people were around. That and still, I do think part of why they end up having to leave Montgomery is the death threats don't go away. And they really persist. And they persist in credible enough ways that, again, that summer in 1957, they decide to leave. So absolutely, and this does, I mean, Rosa Parks spends most of that year of the boycott on the road. Raymond and her mother lives with them. They're both at home. And Raymond gets very depressed, has what she describes as a nervous breakdown because of the kind of persistence of these horrible calls. And they pick back up. When Conyers hires her, it gets into the paper that she's working for him, and Conyers and his office in Detroit gets a ton more kind of hate mail, voodoo dolls, many people and from people in the North. And so I think we don't also want to see this only as a Southern phenomenon, because this happens again in 65, 66, 67 at Conyers' office. E.D. Nixon, certainly one of the things that E.D. Nixon brings to, I think, the NAACP and to the Montgomery bus boycott is years of organizing with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He is, you know, he's also a leader in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. She works for him and sort of does administrative work for his work in the Brotherhood. And so certainly that informs, part of what makes the boycott a success is you have so many people who have political experience kind of coming together around it. Not so much, not so much. Thanks. Yeah.
Hi. First off, thank you so much for your talk. I was very curious, what examples of activism was Rosa Parks involved in once she did move to Detroit, specifically around the criminal justice issues? Because I know that's something that I've never heard of before, so I'm very interested to hear more about that.
So one of the things she helped to found and was a member of many of the kind of prisoner, what we might call political prisoner committees, prisoner defense work. So Angela Davis, Wilmington 10, Gary Tyler, RNA 11. She's doing a lot, Joanne Little, she helps found the Free Joanne Little committee in Detroit. So she's doing a lot of prisoner defense stuff. Lots of prisoners write to her at Conyers' office. Some of those letters are in the papers at the Library of Congress. You can see them. They're asking for her help. She definitely helps in some cases. So she's very aware of she speaks out against the death penalty. She corresponds with many prisoners. She's involved in other. I should say this differerently. She sometimes uses her position in Conyers to advocate or to try to protect prisoners. So she's, you know, this is really where she starts with Scottsboro, and it really is the through line through her work. Thank you. I think this is the last question.
Yeah, a group of black workers at UAW Local 600 invited Parks out and had a fundraiser. Can you talk about that? And when did that happen in the campaign? I had a chance to meet Dave Moore, one of the guys who was involved in that, but I don't remember when that happened. Can you talk
so that happens in the spring of 1956. Local 600, which is a militant UAW local, brings Rosa Parks to Detroit above the objections of Walter Reuther. Right? So I think, you know, she's too militant. They don't want to be associated with the boycott, and so Local 600 raises the money itself and brings her to Detroit. So this is more than a year before they'll move there, but many of the connections, the Local 600 connections, will become friends, colleagues when they actually move there. Another interesting fact about that, Detroit's hotels are segregated at this point. Again, we have this image of hotel segregation being a Deep South problem. They're segregated, so they have to put her up in a black hotel because most of the hotels in Detroit don't serve black people. But yeah, that's the spring of 1956.
Okay,
thank you. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.